My name is Hannah Parker. I'm 25 years old. And the strange thing about the moment a family begins to come apart is that it rarely announces itself like a disaster. There is no thunder, no plate shattering against tile, no cinematic pause where everyone suddenly understands this is the second life will divide itself into before and after. Sometimes it begins in the most ordinary room in the world. Sometimes it begins with pasta on the stove. Sometimes it begins on a Tuesday night with bread in a basket and a bottle of wine already opened, and the person you love smiling across the table at someone who is about to wound her in a way she will never fully forget. That is the part I keep returning to, not because dinner itself matters, but because of how normal it was until it wasn't. My father was at the head of the table. Sandra sat beside him, passing the bread, smiling at something he had just said, unaware that the person across from her had been carrying a storm in silence for weeks, and had apparently chosen that exact moment to let it tear through the room. My sister Renee set down her fork. She looked at Sandra. Then she spoke. I am not going to repeat her exact words. Even now they feel sharp inside me, like something swallowed wrong that still has not worked its way down. But what I can say is this: it was not an argument. Arguments involve movement from both sides. What happened that night was not that. It was a monologue. Cold, measured, prepared. And by the end of it, Sandra was crying without making a sound. My father had gone completely still, and I was sitting there with my hands in my lap, unable to decide whether I should interrupt, defend, leave, or somehow reverse the previous 2 minutes by sheer force of wanting them not to be real. I did none of those things. I just sat there and watched a woman who had done nothing but love us carefully and patiently for 2 years get dismantled at our family table like she had earned it. She had not. That is the truth underneath everything else. No matter how much compassion I have for where my sister's pain came from, Sandra did not earn what happened to her that night. Renee is 28. Our mother died 6 years ago after an illness that lasted a little over a year from diagnosis to the end. I don't want to turn this into a story about those 14 months because they deserve a different kind of telling. But it matters that after she died, the entire structure of our house changed in ways that were hard to explain to anyone outside it. The air felt different, quieter, but not peaceful. My father kept going because he is the kind of man who keeps going. He went to work. He paid bills. He drove me where I needed to go. He called Renee on her birthday. He made sure the roof didn't leak and the lights stayed on and the groceries appeared in the kitchen like stability could be rebuilt through repetition. But something in him dimmed. Not dramatically. That would have been easier to understand. It was more like someone had lowered the lights in a room he still lived in and expected him to function anyway. For 3 years, I watched him exist that way. Not collapsed. Not broken in a visible way. Just quieter than I had ever known him to be. There is a specific kind of sadness that becomes part of the architecture of a person. That was what happened to him. It settled into his posture, his voice, the length of his silences. And after a while, I think some part of me stopped expecting anything to brighten again. Then he met Sandra. It happened through the mutual friend at some small work gathering no one would have predicted mattered. He mentioned her once, casually, about a month after they started talking. But even in that casual mention, there was caution in his voice. He sounded like a man carrying something fragile in both hands, something he wanted to acknowledge without exposing it to weather. Sandra was 51. My father was 54. She had been widowed 7 years before they met. She had one grown son living across the country. She was not loud. She did not enter rooms trying to win them over. She did not perform warmth. She simply had it. The first time I had dinner with her was about 3 months into their relationship, and I remember going in with more resistance than I admitted even to myself. Not because she had done anything wrong, just because grief makes strange guardians out of people. You start protecting things no one is actively trying to steal. I remember watching her that night across the table, waiting for her to overstep, waiting for some sentence that would sound too familiar, too eager, too much like someone trying to slide into a place that still belonged to my mother. It never happened. She asked me questions and listened to the answers. Actually listened. When my father stepped away to get dessert, she turned to me and said quietly, "I know this is strange. I'm not expecting anything from you. I'm just glad to meet you." That was it. No speech about how much she cared. No attempt to reassure me into liking her. No carefully crafted explanation of her intentions. Just one honest sentence from a woman who understood she was stepping into something tender and had no interest in handling it carelessly. I liked her from that night more than I wanted to, more than felt simple. because liking her brought up its own guilt. Missing my mother had not become smaller by then. It had just become less visible. And there was a part of me that still confused acceptance with disloyalty, as if opening the door even a little for a new person meant shutting it harder on the one we had lost. But that conflict was mine, and eventually I dealt with it. Not elegantly, not all at once. But honestly, I let myself care about Sandra because she had earned it in the least theatrical way possible, by being consistent, kind, and real. Renee never got there. I need to say that carefully, because I do not think my sister is a villain. That would make this easier, and it would also be untrue. Renee loved our mother with a kind of intensity that changed shape after the funeral and never changed back. Her grief did not soften over time. It hardened. It turned into something almost architectural, a structure built inside her from memory, loyalty, anger, fear, and the desperate instinct to preserve what had already been lost. She never refused to see Sandra. That is part of why what happened later caught us all off guard. She came to dinners. She was polite. She asked the right questions, gave the right answers, smiled when required, never crossed any obvious line. For 2 years, she maintained that careful surface. And my father, being who he is, chose to believe that meant things were slowly getting better. He is not a man who looks for hidden danger. He is a man who hopes patience will heal what pain has made difficult. He believes in enough time, enough warmth, enough steadiness. And most of the time, those things do help. Just not always. 4 months ago, he proposed to Sandra. He did it privately, at home, just the two of them. No audience, no spectacle. Which felt right, because nothing about their love had ever been performative. It had grown quietly, gently, in the same understated way both of them seemed to move through the world. He told me the next morning. I still remember the sound of his voice on the phone. There was happiness in it, yes, but not the carefree kind. It was more delicate than that. The happiness of someone who knows joy can disappear, who knows not to hold it carelessly, who sounds almost reverent toward the fact that it came back at all. I told him I was happy for him, and I meant it completely. Then he said, after a small pause, I just need you girls to be okay with it. I told him I was. He exhaled. Then he said he had not talked to Renee yet. That pause said more than the sentence itself. Her reaction when he finally told her was not explosive. That matters. If she had screamed or cried or said something brutal right away, maybe none of us would have been so blindsided later. Instead, she was quiet. She said she needed time to think. She said she was happy if he was happy. She said all the right things in the right order. And my father came away from that conversation cautiously hopeful. I think he heard restraint and mistook it for peace. What none of us understood was that the quiet was not peace. It was pressure. It was grief compressing itself into silence until silence could no longer contain it. The dinner where everything came apart was not meant to be important. There was no announcement, no confrontation planned. Sandra had made pasta. There was salad, bread, wine. The kind of easy family dinner that had become normal in those 2 years of trying, slowly, to become something like a blended family without ever saying the phrase out loud. Then Renee set down her fork. She looked straight at Sandra, and something in her face changed. Even now when I replay it, that is the detail that chills me most. Not the words first, the expression, the certainty, as if she had crossed some private point of no return before she ever opened her mouth. She said Sandra was trying to replace someone who could not be replaced. She said watching our father with her felt like watching him erase our mother from the walls of his life. She said the engagement was too fast, that the relationship had moved in a way that made it look less like love and more like a man trying to fill a hole and call it healing. Sandra tried once softly to say, Renee, but Renee kept going. Her voice did not rise. That almost made it worse. There is something more frightening about cruelty delivered calmly, like a conclusion instead of an outburst. She said she had tried to accept it and couldn't. Then she said the line that seemed to drain all the air from the room. She said Sandra must have known she was not fully welcome and had chosen to move forward anyway, which said something about her character. That was the moment Sandra's eyes filled. Not dramatically. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She just sat there, hands folded too tightly in her lap, tears slipping down her face in total silence. My father stood up. He did not slam his hand on the table. He did not shout. He just said, Renee, once, quietly, but in a tone I had only heard a few times in my life. A tone that meant he was no longer angry. He was hurt beyond anger. Renee pushed back her chair. For 1 second, I thought she might break. Apologize. Collapse. Something. Instead, she stood there with her jaw tight and said, I'm sorry you feel that way. Then she left. The door did not slam. Somehow, that made the silence afterward even more unbearable. Sandra remained seated, crying soundlessly. My father put his hand over hers and stared at the wall like he was trying not to let the entire room see whatever was happening inside him. And I sat there frozen, hating myself for how useless I felt. I stayed afterward and helped clean up. That is such a small sentence for what it was. I rinsed dishes while my father dried them. The faucet ran. Cabinets opened and closed. Silverware clicked softly into drawers. It all felt grotesquely normal, like our bodies were obeying a script written for an ordinary night, while our minds were still back at the table, watching the scene repeat. Sandra had gone into the living room. From the kitchen, I could see her sitting on the couch with her hands in her lap, not looking at her phone, not pretending to be busy, just sitting there in the wreckage of a night she had done nothing to create. I thought about going to her. I thought about kneeling in front of her and saying something clear and decent and useful. I am so sorry. You did not deserve that. This is not your fault. But I said nothing. Cowardice sometimes looks like shock. I know that now. Before I left, my father walked me to the door. He stood there for a second, one hand still on the knob, and when I looked at him, I saw something worse than anger. Exhaustion. A very specific kind. Not physical tiredness. The tiredness of a man standing between two people he loves, realizing he cannot protect either one from what the other has already done. He said quietly, "I don't know what to do with this." He wasn't asking. He wasn't expecting me to solve it. He was just saying it out loud because pain sometimes needs a witness. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time. I thought about my mother, about what she would have said if she were somehow here to see all of it. But grief does strange things to memory. It sands down contradiction. It turns real people into symbols. And I could not tell whether the version of her in my mind was truthful enough to answer that question. I thought instead about Sandra sitting in that living room with her hands folded like she was trying to hold herself together without asking anyone else to help. I thought about the 2 years she had spent being patient, kind, and careful with 2 grown daughters carrying pain she did not cause, and how none of that had protected her from one dinner on a Tuesday night. The wedding is on hold now. My father told me that the following week, over the phone, his voice steady in the way people make their voices steady when they are trying not to burden someone else with the full weight of what they feel. He said they were not calling anything off, but they were not moving forward while things with Renee were unresolved. Then he told me something that has stayed lodged in me ever since. It had been Sandra's idea to pause. Sandra, who had just been told she forced her way into a place she did not belong, had responded by saying she did not want to move forward in any way that damaged my father's relationship with his daughter. I sat there gripping my phone in silence. A woman who had just been humiliated at our table was still protecting us, still protecting him. I did not know what to do with that either. Renee texted my father the next morning. A short message. "I love you. I'm sorry for how it came out, but I meant what I said." He did not answer right away. He waited until the following evening and wrote back, "I love you too. We need to talk when you're ready." She has not said she is ready. I spoke to her once, briefly, a few days after the dinner. She asked if I was angry. I told her I didn't know what I was. She said she had needed to say it. I asked if she felt better. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Not really." And I believed her, because I do not think my sister is cruel. I think she is wounded in a way that calcified. I think she loved our mother so fiercely that part of her came to see any new happiness in our father's life as evidence of some terrible betrayal. I think she mistook unresolved grief for moral clarity. I understand that. I do. And she was still wrong. Both things are true. I can hold softness for where her pain came from and still know she aimed it at the wrong person. 10 days after the dinner, Sandra sent me a message. It was short, careful, very much like her. She said she hoped I was okay. She said she didn't want me to feel caught between people or pressured to take sides. Then she said she was fine. I did not believe that part, but I understood why she wrote it. I wrote back and told her I was sorry she had to sit through that. I told her none of what was said reflected the truth of who she had been to this family. She replied, "Thank you. That was all." But it mattered. My father still lives in the house we grew up in. The house where my mother lived, got sick, and died. Sandra has never stayed overnight there. That was his choice. He wanted to move carefully. He wanted nothing to feel overwritten. He has been careful every step of this relationship. He did not rush. He did not replace. He fell in love again after years of grief and carried that love forward as gently as he could. And still here we are. One daughter found a way to let that happiness exist. The other couldn't. And now my father is standing between the woman he loves and the daughter he loves, with no clean path toward either of them that does not wound the other first. I don't know how this ends. I only know that 6 weeks ago, on an ordinary Tuesday night, my sister looked across a dinner table and split open something that had taken years to build. And ever since then, all of us have been standing in the silence afterward, trying to decide whether this family is still capable of becoming whole again. 6 weeks have passed since that dinner, and my father's house has changed in a way that is hard to explain unless you have lived inside a place where tension has settled into the walls. Nothing looks different at first. That is what makes it unsettling. The furniture is where it has always been. The framed photos still line the hallway. The kitchen still smells faintly like coffee in the mornings and dish soap in the evenings. The curtains still move when the windows are cracked open. On paper, it is the same house. But grief and waiting have a way of altering a space without moving a single object. Now when I walk in, the quiet feels too organized, too complete, as if everyone inside it is trying not to disturb something fragile and invisible. I went over last Saturday afternoon. My father was in the study rearranging the bookshelf. Not dramatically. Just shifting things a few inches left, then right, then back again. The kind of task people invent when their hands need somewhere to put the restlessness their minds cannot discharge. I stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment before he noticed me. He looked up, smiled, and said, "Hey, kid." And if you only saw that version of him for 5 seconds, you might think he was fine. That is the thing about my father. He almost always looks fine. The not fine reveals itself in smaller ways. In the mug of coffee that had gone cold on the desk beside him because he had apparently forgotten he poured it. In the stack of books on the floor that did not need moving. In the way he paused halfway through saying something, like he had lost the thread not just of the sentence, but of some larger internal structure holding the sentence up. I walked in and leaned against the doorframe. "Reorganizing?" He gave a half smile. Apparently. There was a looseness to the word that made my chest hurt. I stepped farther into the room and picked up one of the books from the floor. It was one of my mother's old cookbooks, the spine softened from years of use. He noticed what I was holding and said quietly, "I wasn't getting rid of anything." "I know," I said, and I did know. That was not what this was. He was not removing memories. He was trying to make a shelf obey him because life currently would not. I set the book down and followed him into the kitchen a few minutes later. We talked about ordinary things at first. My job, a neighbor's dog that kept getting out, whether the air conditioner was making a strange noise or he was imagining it. Families do this when the real subject is too large. We circle. We touch the edges of normalcy, because sometimes naming the actual wound feels like pressing a hand directly into fire. Eventually, he opened the refrigerator, stared into it for a beat too long, and asked if I wanted iced tea. I said yes. He nodded, then stood there another second without moving, like he had forgotten what came next. I crossed quietly to the cabinet and got the glasses myself. He noticed, and for a flicker of a second, something passed across his face. Embarrassment, maybe? Or gratitude? Maybe both. He poured the tea and said, without looking up, "Sandra asked about you." My fingers tightened around the glass. "How is she?" He let out a breath through his nose. "Trying." The word sat heavily between us. Trying. Not fine. Not healed. Not moving on. Trying. I wanted to ask him everything all at once. How often he saw her now, whether she had cried again, whether he was sleeping, whether he was angry at Renee, whether he was angry at himself for not seeing the explosion coming. Instead, I asked, "Have you talked much?" He nodded once. "A lot, actually." Then, after a pause, "Just not about wedding things." I looked at him. He leaned one hand on the counter, tiredness pulling gently at his shoulders. "She wants to keep the engagement," he said, "but no date, no planning, nothing until things are better." He gave a small, almost humorless smile at the word better, like he didn't trust it and didn't know what else to use. "She really insisted?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He looked up then. "Yes." Something changed in his voice on that word. Not surprise exactly. Something deeper. The sound of a man still trying to absorb the scale of someone else's generosity. "She made it very clear," he said. "She said she would not move forward with me if it meant damaging my relationship with Renee beyond repair." He said it carefully, like every word still carried weight. Then, quieter, she was firm about it. I looked down at the tea in my glass, so he would not see the expression on my face too clearly. Because it did something to me, hearing it said out loud again. Sandra had been publicly wounded, accused of trespassing emotionally into our family, reduced to some opportunistic symbol in my sister's grief. and her response had been to protect the relationship between my father and the daughter who hurt her. There are people who would call that saintly. There are people who would call it foolish. Mostly, I think it is simply rare, and rarity has its own force. I said, "She loves you." My father's eyes moved toward the window above the sink. For a moment, he did not answer. Then he said very softly, "I know." There was so much in those two words that I had to look away, because he did know. He knew he had found someone remarkable. He knew it had happened later than he once imagined possible. He knew it was real. And he also knew that every step toward that happiness now seemed to come with a cost attached to it. That is the particular cruelty of this whole thing. He is not being asked to choose between love and indifference. He is being made to stand between two loves. And there is no clean way to survive that. Sandra and I had spoken briefly on the phone once after the dinner, but about a week after my visit with my father, I drove to her house. She rents a small place with a wraparound porch and flower pots that look like they are doing better than mine ever do. It suits her. The house is quiet without feeling empty. Lived in, but not crowded. Thoughtful. Calm. She opened the door wearing jeans and a loose sweater, her hair pulled back, and for one terrible second I had a flash of that Tuesday night, her at the table, silent tears sliding down her face, and I almost lost my nerve. But she smiled when she saw me. Not brightly, gently, like she understood exactly how much effort it had taken both of us to arrive at this porch and sit across from each other, pretending coffee was the reason. We sat outside with mugs warming our hands. There was a wind moving through the trees, and somewhere nearby a dog barked twice, then stopped. For the first few minutes, we talked around things. The weather, her son, a show she had started watching and did not like enough to continue. I could feel us both respecting the fragility of the real conversation, waiting to touch it carefully. She touched it first. "How is your father?" she asked. Not "how are you" first. Not "has Renee said anything?" Your father. That told me everything about where her heart still was. I looked down at my coffee. He's holding it together. Sandra gave a small nod that suggested she understood both the truth and the insufficiency of that phrase. "He's good at that," she said. I smiled a little despite myself. "Yeah, he is." Then she asked very calmly, "And how is your sister?" I looked up sharply enough that she must have noticed, because she added, "I'm not asking out of defensiveness." "I know," I said too quickly. And I did know. That was the unnerving thing about Sandra. She kept giving people the most generous possible interpretation, even when they had done very little to earn it. I told her the truth, which was not much. That Renee and I had spoken only briefly. That she was not exactly retracting what she said. That she did seem shaken by the aftermath, though maybe not yet ready to face the full scope of it. Sandra listened without interrupting. Then she stirred her coffee once and said, "She doesn't need to like me." I frowned slightly. She continued, "She just needs to be okay." The sentence landed so cleanly that I felt it before I fully understood it. "She doesn't need to like me," she repeated. "Those are different things." I stared at her. I think she must have seen something shift in my face, because she gave the faintest sad smile. "I'm not trying to win a popularity contest," she said. If being with your father hurts her in a way that keeps getting worse, that matters. Whether she likes me personally is not really the point." I did not answer right away, because I was too busy thinking about how unusual that was. Most people, when hurt, rush instinctively toward being understood, toward defending themselves, toward proving they were right and the other person was wrong. Sandra seemed almost uninterested in any of that, not because she lacked pride, because she had somehow placed the emotional reality of the whole family above the immediate satisfaction of her own injury. That kind of maturity can make you feel both grateful and ashamed at once. I said finally, "You didn't do anything wrong?" She looked out into the yard for a moment. "I know that," she said. Mostly. That word pierced me more than if she had said she was devastated, because it told me some small part of her was still searching herself for where she might have overstepped, where she might have unknowingly walked into sacred ground with too much confidence, where she might somehow deserve a fraction of what had happened. The injustice of that almost made me angry. I wanted to protect her from her own humility. Instead, I asked, "Are you angry at her?" Sandra was quiet long enough that I wondered if she would answer. Then she said, "No. Don't know." I must have looked unconvinced, because she added, "I was hurt. I am hurt. But angry isn't the word." "Then what is?" She exhaled slowly. "Sad, I think, for all of you, for her too." That was the moment I understood. There are some people whose goodness is not soft in the weak sense. It is disciplined, chosen, maintained, even when it would be easier, and in some ways more justified, to harden. I wrote that sentence down later after I got home, She doesn't need to like me. She just needs to be okay. Because something in it felt central to the entire disaster. Renee and I spoke 3 times in those 6 weeks. The first 2 conversations barely counted. One was about whether she still had a set of old legal documents my father needed from the filing cabinet she took after our mother died. The other was about a cousin's birthday dinner neither of us really wanted to attend. Both calls hovered nervously around the real subject, like birds afraid of landing. The third call lasted 40 minutes. It happened on a Thursday night after I had spent most of the day telling myself I was not going to push and then pushing anyway. She answered sounding tired. Not theatrically tired, just worn thin. We talked about work first, then traffic, then a friend of hers who had gotten engaged and chosen a destination wedding everyone was pretending to be excited about. Finally, I said Renee, just her name. The way people do when they are placing a hand on the table between them and asking, without saying it directly, "Can we stop performing now?" There was silence. Then she said, "I know." Her voice cracked very slightly on the second word. I leaned back against my couch and closed my eyes. "Then talk to me." Another long silence. Then she said, "I know how it came out was wrong." It was the first clean admission she had made. I held still, almost afraid to interrupt the opening. She went on. "I know it was cruel. I know she didn't deserve it like that." Like that. Not an apology yet, but movement. I said carefully, "Do you still mean what you said?" She did not answer right away, and in that silence I could hear the complexity of her, not because she was reconsidering the facts, but because she was realizing facts are not the only thing that matter once you have used them like weapons. "Yes," she said eventually, "I still mean it. Or, I mean some of it. I mean what it feels like." The distinction mattered. Not what is true, what it feels like. I sat up straighter. "What does it feel like?" The breath she took then sounded shaky enough that for a second I imagined her standing by a window, one hand pressed to her forehead, the way she used to do when she was trying not to cry in front of anyone. "It feels," she said slowly, "like Mom gets further away every time he builds something new." There it was. Not Sandra. Not the wedding. Not even really my father. The vanishing. The fear that love, redistributed, becomes erasure. I let the silence stay a moment before answering. "Do you really believe he's erasing her?" "No," she said too quickly, then softer. "Not exactly." I waited. She made a sound like frustration aimed inward. "I know that's not what he's trying to do. I know he loved her. I know he still does. I know all of that. But sometimes when I'm there and Sandra is in the kitchen and he looks happy, I feel like I'm watching a room change color, and I didn't agree to it." The sentence hit me hard because it was honest in a way anger rarely is. Not fair. Not correct. But honest. I understood it immediately, which did not make the damage smaller. I said, "You hurt someone who didn't deserve to be carrying that for you." She exhaled sharply. "I know." I almost stopped there, almost let the moment rest. But I thought about my father standing in the study pretending bookshelves needed urgent attention. I thought about Sandra on her porch, still more concerned with everyone else's pain than her own. So I said it. "The wedding is on hold because of you." Renee was silent. Then, very quietly, I figured. "It was Sandra's idea." That changed the silence. You can hear a person go still over the phone sometimes. You really can. When she finally spoke, her voice was stripped of some layer it usually carries, some defense she wears like skin. "I didn't know that." "I know," I said. "Nothing for a few seconds." Then she asked, "Why?" The question was so bare it almost undid me. "Because she doesn't want to be the reason Dad loses you," I said. Renee made a small sound in the back of her throat. Not quite a sob, not quite speech. Something more private and involuntary than either. "She said that?" "Not in those exact words, but yes." Renee did not respond. I pictured her sitting somewhere with one hand over her mouth, staring at a wall, replaying the dinner through a lens she had not allowed herself to use before. Finally, she said, "I didn't know that." Again. And this time it sounded less like information and more like grief. I did not push further. There is a point in some conversations where another sentence becomes intrusion. We stayed on the phone a few more minutes after that, but the center had already shifted. Even when we moved back to safer topics, something in her had loosened. Not healed, not resolved, just cracked open enough for light to get under it. After we hung up, I sat on my bed in the dark and thought about how often families mistake silence for progress. How often people call something manageable when what they really mean is contained. Contained is not healed. Contained is not accepted. Contained is just pressure with good manners. The grief under all of this stopped looking abstract to me after that phone call. It became visible. Renee was 22 when our mother died. She was in the second year of graduate school. She came home and handled everything. The hospital paperwork, the flowers, the calls, the logistics. She sat beside my father at the funeral in a black dress, with her spine so straight she looked almost regal. Everyone praised her for being strong. I did too. Now I wonder whether all of us confused competence with processing. I fell apart differently. In showers, in parked cars, in grocery store aisles when I saw food my mother used to buy. My grief leaked all over my life in small, private humiliations. Renee's did not leak, not visibly. It calcified. It organized itself into function and posture and control until one Tuesday night at dinner, 6 years later, it finally came out in a form sharp enough to cut someone innocent. That does not excuse it, but it explains why the wound underneath it is older than Sandra, older than the engagement, maybe even older than any of us have wanted to say out loud. 2 weeks later, my father called me at 10 at night, late enough that when I saw his name on my phone, I sat upright immediately. His voice, when I answered, was steady but low. He said he and Sandra had had another long conversation. They had decided to remain engaged, but they were setting no date, no plans, nothing public, nothing moving forward until things were more settled. Settled, I repeated, because sometimes you buy yourself a second to think by echoing a word. He gave a tired little laugh. I know. Then he said, "She made me promise not to cut Renee out." That was the line that stayed with me. Not just because it was kind, because it cost Sandra something to say it. Every act of patience costs someone something. People romanticize that too much. They talk about grace like it is effortless. It is not. Grace is expensive. It is a choice people make while swallowing feelings they are entitled to express. My father's voice shifted on the phone. She was very clear, he said. She said if I tried to make this easier by stepping back from Renee, she would consider that the wrong way forward. He went quiet for a moment. Then, I don't know how I got someone like her. It was one of the saddest things I had ever heard him say. Not because it sounded insecure. Because it sounded grateful in a wounded way. Like he had finally found a kind of love that knew how to hold complexity. And he was terrified complexity might still destroy it. I told him, "You found someone remarkable." And he said, I know I did. That night, after we hung up, I stood at my kitchen sink thinking about all three of them. My father, trying to stay loyal in two directions at once. Sandra, choosing patience even when fairness would have justified anger. Renee, still carrying 6 years of grief like a sealed room inside her chest. And me, in the middle, understanding more than I wanted to and able to fix none of it. The truth was becoming clearer by then. This was no longer just about one terrible dinner. It was about whether grief, once it hardens, can still be softened without shattering the person carrying it. It was about whether love can survive being blamed for pain it did not create. It was about whether my sister could bear to look directly at the damage she had done without protecting herself from it. And it was about whether my father, after years of dimmed light, would be allowed to keep the happiness he had finally found. At the end of that 6-week stretch, I called Renee again. Not to argue, not to interrogate. I asked if she wanted to go for a walk the following Sunday. For a second, I thought she might say no. Instead, she said yes. That yes was small, but it felt like the first real movement we had seen since the night everything split open. I did not know yet what she was ready to say. I did not know whether she would reach for repair or retreat again into silence. I only knew that for the first time since the dinner, it felt possible that the next conversation might not just circle the wound. It might finally press into it, and maybe, if we were very careful, begin. The thing about grief is that it doesn't disappear. It changes shape. Sometimes it softens into memory, something you can carry without it cutting into your hands every time you touch it. And sometimes it hardens, becomes structure, becomes belief, becomes something you defend, even when defending it starts to hurt people who had nothing to do with its origin. By the time I met Renee at the park that Sunday morning, I knew that whatever happened next was not really about Sandra anymore. Sandra was just where it had landed. The actual weight had been building for 6 years. The park was one we used to go to when we were younger, before everything, before hospital rooms and quiet houses and learning how to speak around absence. Back when a walk was just a walk. Not a strategy, not an attempt to salvage something fragile. Just movement for the sake of movement. Renee was already there when I arrived. Standing near the path, hands in the pockets of her jacket, looking out at nothing in particular. She looked the same. That was the unsettling part. No visible crack. No sign that anything inside her had shifted. But I had heard her voice on the phone. I knew something had. "Hey," I said as I approached. She turned and gave a small nod. "Hey." We started walking without deciding on a direction. That felt right. For the first hour, we did exactly what we had done on the phone. We avoided it, talked about work, about a show she had been watching, about a trip she was thinking about taking in the fall. We moved through the park like two people practicing normalcy, like if we did it long enough, maybe the rest of our lives would follow. But there is a limit to how long you can pretend something is not sitting between you. With about 20 minutes left in the walk, she said it. I think about that night every day. No preamble, no easing into it. Just the truth, placed carefully in the space between us. I know, I said. We kept walking. The gravel under our shoes made a steady, grounding sound. I don't know how to take it back, she said after a minute. I let that sit. You probably can't, I said, not completely. She nodded slightly, eyes still forward. Then what am I supposed to do? There it was. The question that matters more than regret. Not can I undo it. What now? I looked at her. You do the next thing. She glanced at me, frowning a little. What does that even mean? I held her gaze for a second. I think you already know. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. That was something. We walked the rest of the loop mostly in silence, but it was a different silence than before. Not avoidance, not pressure. Something more open, like a door that had been locked, was now at least unlatched. I didn't push her beyond that. You can't drag someone into accountability. They have to step into it themselves. And Renee, for all her flaws, for all the damage she had caused, was not someone who did anything halfway. If she moved, she would move fully. The question was whether she would move at all. After that walk, I found myself thinking more about our mother than I had in months. Not in the distant, softened way memory tends to become over time, but in detail, in texture, in truth. She was not an easy person. That is something grief tends to erase. It turns people into something simpler than they were, kinder, softer, less complicated. But my mother had been complicated. She had a presence that filled a room the moment she entered it. Her laugh was too loud for small spaces. Her opinions came quickly and fully formed. She loved us in a way that was expansive, overwhelming sometimes, impossible to misunderstand. And when she was sick, she was angry. Not always, but often enough that the anger became part of the memory. She did not go quietly. She did not shrink. She remained exactly who she had always been, just in a body that was slowly failing her. I think that matters, because when I think about Renee sitting across from Sandra that night, I realize she wasn't just reacting to Sandra. She was reacting to the contrast. Sandra is quiet, measured. She doesn't take up space unless invited to. She doesn't impose. She waits. She listens. She enters carefully. My mother never entered carefully. She arrived, fully, unapologetically. And I think for Renee, watching our father fall in love again, but this time with someone so different, felt like more than just moving on. It felt like a replacement of something essential. Not person for person, but energy for energy, presence for presence, as if the space our mother had occupied was being repainted in a color she didn't recognize, and maybe didn't want to. I understand that, truly. But understanding something does not mean it does not cause harm. You can trace a wound all the way back to its origin and still be left with the damage it created in the present. That is where we were now, standing in the aftermath, trying to decide what mattered more, the reason or the repair. A few days after the walk, my father called me again, earlier this time, around 7 in the evening. He sounded steadier, not better, but less frayed at the edges. I saw Sandra today, he said. I leaned back against the couch. Yeah? Yeah. A pause. We had lunch, talked for a while. I waited. We're good, he said finally. And I could hear that he meant it. Not everything, but the part between them, the part that had nothing to do with us. That part was intact. How is she? I asked. He let out a breath, still being more understanding than she should have to be. I smiled faintly. That sounds like her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, She told me something I can't stop thinking about. What? She said she had decided early on that fairness wasn't the standard she was going to use. I sat up slightly. What does that mean? It means, he said slowly, that she knew loving someone with a past like mine, with kids like you and Renee, was going to be complicated. And she decided that just because something felt unfair didn't mean it wasn't still worth doing. I didn't answer right away, because that is not how most people think. Most people measure what they give against what they receive. They look for balance, for reciprocity. Sandra had stepped into something knowing it might not be balanced, and chosen it anyway. I started, then stopped. I know, my father said quietly. There was something in his voice again. That mix. Gratitude. And something heavier. The awareness that someone else is carrying weight for you, and you cannot take it back from them without losing what they are trying to protect. I don't know how long she can keep doing that, he added. That was the fear underneath everything. Not whether she would leave, but whether staying would eventually cost her too much. Renee and I didn't talk again for about a week after the walk. I didn't push. I didn't call. I let the space exist. Sometimes pressure doesn't create movement. It creates resistance. And the last thing we needed was for her to retreat again. During that week, I went back to Sandra's house one more time. This time it felt easier. Not because anything had been resolved, but because the first conversation had removed the awkwardness of pretending nothing had happened. We sat on the porch again. Same chairs, same mugs, different air. She asked about the walk before I could bring it up. "Did you see her?" she said. "I did." "And?" I considered how to answer. "She's thinking." Sandra nodded. "That's good." I studied her for a moment. "You're not going to ask what she said?" She gave a small smile. "I figured if you wanted to tell me, you would." That was so completely in character that I almost laughed. "She knows she hurt you," I said. Sandra looked down at her hands. "I would hope so." She said she doesn't know how to take it back. Sandra's fingers tightened slightly around her mug. "You can't take something like that back," she said softly. "No," I agreed, "but you can do something after." She looked up then. Our eyes met, and for the first time since that dinner, I saw something shift in her expression. Not hope, not quite, but openness. Like she was allowing the possibility that something might still come from all of this. "She doesn't need to like me," Sandra said again, almost to herself. "She just needs to be okay." I nodded. "She might be getting there." Sandra held my gaze for a second longer. Then she looked away, out at the yard. "I hope so," she said. And there was something in her voice this time that hadn't been there before. Not just patience, investment. As if she had decided, consciously, that she was not just waiting for this to resolve. She was part of whatever resolution might come. Hey. A few days later, Renee texted me. It was short. "Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "Yes." She called that night. Her voice sounded different, quieter, but not closed. "I've been thinking," she said. I didn't interrupt. "I keep replaying it," she continued. "What I said, how I said it." A pause. "I can't hear it the same way anymore." That was new. "How do you hear it now?" I asked. She exhaled slowly. "Like I was trying to protect something," she said. "But I ended up just hurting someone who wasn't the threat." There it was. Not a full apology, but the beginning of one. "What are you going to do?" I asked gently. She didn't answer right away. And in that silence, I could feel the weight of what that question meant. Because this wasn't about saying sorry to me, or even to our father. It was about facing Sandra, facing the person she had reduced to tears, facing the reality of what she had done without the shield of grief to justify it. "I don't know," she said finally. Honest, uncomfortable, real. "But I know I can't just leave it like this." I closed my eyes for a second. Relief didn't come all at once. But it started there. Small, cautious, possible. "I think that's the next thing," I said. She was quiet. Then, almost to herself, "Yeah, we didn't resolve anything in that call. But we didn't need to." Because for the first time since that Tuesday night, Renee was no longer standing firmly behind what she had done. She was standing in front of it, looking at it. And that is where change begins. Fine. That night, after we hung up, I stood by my window thinking about everything that had happened over the past 6 weeks. My father still waiting. Sandra still choosing patience. Renee finally beginning to turn toward the damage instead of away from it. And me, still in the middle. Still holding all the versions of the truth at once. Understanding my sister's pain. Seeing Sandra's kindness. Watching my father try to love both without losing either. There was no clean resolution yet. No moment where everything snapped back into place. But something had shifted. Something small. Something fragile. Something that could still be lost if handled carelessly. Or built if handled right. The next step was not mine. It was Renee's. And for the first time, I believed she might actually take it. The thing about repair is that it doesn't arrive with the same force as damage. Damage is loud, even when it's delivered quietly. It changes the air in a room. It leaves people stunned, disoriented, certain that something irreversible has just happened. Repair is the opposite. It is small, careful, often almost invisible to anyone who isn't directly involved. And most of the time, it begins with one person deciding to do something that feels deeply uncomfortable and absolutely necessary at the same time. Renee didn't tell me when she reached out to Sandra. I found out afterward, which in a way felt right. Because whatever that moment was, it didn't belong to me. It belonged to the two people sitting across from each other, one holding the memory of what had been said, the other holding the weight of having said it. I was at work when my phone buzzed with a message from my father. Just 3 words. She talked to her. I stared at the screen longer than I probably should have. Then I typed back, "How did it go?" There was a pause, long enough that I imagined him sitting somewhere, reading the question, deciding how much to say. Finally, my phone buzzed again. It was hard, but it was good. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Hard, but good. That sounded right. That sounded honest. I didn't hear the details until later that evening when Renee called me. Her voice was different again, not lighter, but clearer, like something inside her had finally been said out loud and was no longer pressing against the inside of her chest. I saw her, she said. I know. A small exhale. I didn't think I was going to be able to do it, she admitted. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I went in. I pictured it immediately. Her hands tight on the steering wheel, her jaw set, running through the conversation in her head over and over again, trying to find a version of it that didn't make her feel exposed. What made you go in? I asked. She was quiet for a second. Then, because not going in felt worse. That made sense. Avoidance can feel like relief in the moment, but over time it starts to rot something deeper. What did you say? I asked gently. Another pause. Then she said, I told her I was sorry. The simplicity of that sentence hit harder than anything else she could have said. No qualifiers. No explanations. No but. Just sorry. I told her I knew I hurt her, she continued, that the way I said everything was cruel. Her voice caught slightly on that word. Cruel. Naming it matters. Not softening it. Not reframing it. Seeing it clearly. I told her I still have complicated feelings about everything, she added. About Dad. About all of it. But that none of that gave me the right to say what I said the way I said it. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, because that was it. Not perfection. Not resolution. Accountability. Real, uncomfortable, necessary accountability. What did she say? I asked. Renee let out a slow breath. She listened. Of course she did. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She just let me say it. Renee paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened in a way I hadn't heard in a long time. She said, thank you. I swallowed. That sounded exactly like Sandra. Not dramatic. Not vindictive. Just present. She said she knew I was hurting, Renee went on. That she didn't take what I said as proof that I was a bad person. There was a slight tremor in her voice now. That almost made it worse. I understood that immediately. Being met with kindness when you expect anger can be disarming in a way anger never is. It removes your ability to stay defensive, forces you to sit fully inside what you've done. What else? I asked. Renee hesitated. Then, she said she doesn't need me to like her. I let out a small breath. Of course she said that. She said she just needs me to be okay. The same sentence. The same quiet, steady truth. I didn't know what to say to that, Renee admitted. You don't have to, I said softly. Another pause. Then more quietly. I told her I'm trying. I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. That's enough, I said. And I meant it, because trying is where everything begins. A few days later, I went to my father's house again. This time, when I walked in, something felt different. Not fixed, not fully resolved, but lighter, subtly, like the air had shifted just enough to let something move through it again. My father was in the kitchen, not rearranging anything, just standing at the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He looked up when I came in, and for the first time in weeks, the smile that crossed his face reached his eyes. Hey, he said. Hey. I set my bag down and leaned against the counter. We didn't talk about it right away. We didn't need to. There are moments when the absence of tension says more than any conversation could. Finally, he said, I heard you went for a walk with your sister. I did. He nodded. She told me. Another pause. She talked to Sandra too. I know. He looked down at his coffee, then back up at me. It meant a lot. Simple, but heavy with everything underneath it. I stepped closer and rested my hand lightly on his arm. I think things are moving, I said. He nodded slowly. Yeah, not certainty, but hope. And hope, after everything, felt like something worth holding on to. Sandra came over that evening. It wasn't planned in any formal way. She just came, like she used to. Like maybe she was testing whether she still could. I watched from the living room as she stepped inside, pausing just slightly in the doorway, as if giving the house a moment to accept her again. My father walked up to her. There was a brief hesitation, so small most people wouldn't notice it. Then he reached for her hand, and she let him. That was it. No big moment. No declaration. Just contact. Quiet. Steady. Real. Later, we all sat in the living room. Not as a full family. Not yet. Renee wasn't there. But the absence didn't feel as sharp as it had before, because now it felt temporary. Not permanent. Sandra and I talked about small things. My father listened. And every so often, I would catch him looking at her in that same careful way he had when he first mentioned her to me years ago. Like he still understood exactly what he had and exactly how easily it could be lost. That night, after Sandra left, my father walked me to the door again. Same place, same posture, but different. Less weight in his shoulders, less exhaustion in his eyes. Not gone, but eased. She's something, he said quietly. I smiled. Yeah, she is. He looked out into the dark for a moment. Then he said something that stayed with me. She loves me enough to protect the things I love, even when those things hurt her. I didn't answer right away, because there was nothing to add to that. It was complete on its own. After a moment, he added, softer, I just need everyone to see that. I nodded. I think they're starting to. He looked at me then, and for the first time since that Tuesday night, there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Relief. Not full, not finished, but real. It hasn't all been fixed. That would be too simple. Renee still has things she needs to work through. Sandra still carries the memory of that night. My father is still navigating the space between them, careful with every step. And I am still in the middle, still seeing all of it, still understanding more than I sometimes wish I did. But something changed the moment Renee walked into that room and chose to face what she had done. Not erase it, not justify it, face it. That is where families either stay broken or begin, slowly, imperfectly, to come back together. There is no clean ending to this story. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way people like to imagine. But the house is no longer as quiet as it was. The coffee doesn't sit untouched as often. The bookshelves are staying where they are. And somewhere, in the middle of all of that, 3 people who love the same man in very different ways are trying to find a way to stand in the same room again, without anyone bleeding.